Ever wonder how scientists, figure out why we do what we do?
Yeah, it's a question that's like fascinated thinkers for centuries.
Oh, yeah.
But today, we're going to dive into a unique approach pioneered by psychologist Clark L. Hull.
Clark L. Hull.
Yeah, you familiar with him at all?
I am, yeah. Dedicated his career to developing a really scientific system for understanding behavior.
Right.
We're going to explore excerpts from his pretty landmark work, Principles of Behavior.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Now, I'll admit, when I first heard about this scientific system idea, I was a bit skeptical.
Okay, yeah.
Can we really explain something as complex as human behavior with the same kind of rigor we use in, physics or chemistry?
That was Hull's ambition, and it's what makes his work so fascinating.
Yeah.
He wanted to move away from vague, subjective notions about the mind,
Okay.
and instead focus on observable, measurable aspects of behavior.
So instead of just speculating about why someone might feel sad,
Right.
Hall wanted to identify concrete factors that could predict and explain their actions.
Exactly. He believed that even complex behaviors can be broken down into simpler components and understood through a system of interconnected principles,
Okay.
kind of like a mathematical formula for actions.
A formula for actions. That's a pretty bold idea.
It is, it is.
So where does he even begin to build this system?
He starts with a fundamental observation. An organism's ability to move,
Right.
essential for its survival.
Right.
Think about it. Finding food, escaping danger, even finding a mate, all depends on being able to act in a changing environment.
That makes sense. If you can't move, you're pretty much stuck.
Yeah.
But how does simply moving around translate into the complex behaviors we see in, animals and humans?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Hull argues that understanding the physiological mechanics of movement,
Right.
muscles, nerves, and so on,
Yeah.
it's only part of the picture.
So he's not just interested in how our bodies move, but why we move in particular ways.
Exactly. He's looking at the bigger picture, the purpose and outcome of those movements.
Got it.
He calls this focus on the overall goal of behavior, molar behavior.
Molar behavior.
Yeah, have you heard that before?
I like that. It's about understanding the whole tooth, not just the individual pieces.
Precisely. And here's where it gets even more intriguing. Hull believed that by studying behavior at this molar level,
Okay.
we could actually gain insights that would help us understand the brain itself.
So by figuring out the software of behavior, we could unlock the secrets of the hardware.
That was his hope.
Interesting.
He saw this approach as a way to bridge the gap between psychology and physiology,
Okay.
connecting the mind and the body in a truly scientific way.
Now that's an ambitious goal.
Very much so.
So how does he go about building this bridge?
Well, he starts by looking at how organisms perceive and interact with their environment.
Okay.
He focuses on the role of receptors, those specialized cells that detect different types of energy in the world around us.
You mean like lights, sound, temperature?
Yeah, all those things.
All those things our senses pick up on.
Exactly. Receptors are our windows to the world.
Okay.
But they don't just passively receive information. They transform those various forms of energy into neural impulses that our nervous system can understand.
So it's like they're translating the outside world into a language our brains can read?
A perfect analogy.
Okay.
And here's a fascinating detail that might surprise you. You might think we have a single type of receptor for temperature,
Right.
like a thermometer.
Yeah, makes sense.
But we actually have separate receptors for sensing heat and cold.
Really? That's incredible.
It is, it is.
Makes you realize how much complexity is hidden beneath the surface of our everyday experiences.
Right.
But sensing the world is only half the battle, right?
Right, sure.
We also need to be able to act on that information.
That's where muscles come in.
Muscles?
They're the engines of action, the primary means by which we move and interact with our surroundings.
So receptors gather information,
Right.
and muscles put that information into action.
That's a good way to put it.
What determines which muscles contract and how forcefully they do so?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And Hull explains this through what's called the all or none law of muscle fiber contraction.
All or nothing. Sounds pretty dramatic.
It is in a way.
Okay.
This law basically states that a muscle fiber either contracts completely or not at all. There's no in between.
But how do we get the smooth, controlled movements if our muscles are so binary?
It all comes down to the incredible complexity of how those muscle fibers are organized and activated.
Okay.
Think of it like an orchestra.
Okay.
Each individual instrument can only play one note at a time.
Right.
But by combining those notes in different ways,
Yeah.
you can create an infinite variety of melodies.
So the amazing diversity of animal behavior comes not from different types of muscles,
Right.
but from the countless ways they can be arranged and combined.
Precisely. It's like having a limited set of building blocks,
Yeah,
but being able to create anything you can imagine with them.
I like that.
But here's a question for you to consider.
How
We've
about-
talked about the senses and how our bodies move.
Right.
But what is it that actually makes us want to move in the first place? What gives our actions purpose and direction?
That's a great question. We don't just randomly contract muscles all day long.
Right.
There's usually a reason behind our movements.
There is. There
We
is.
left off talking about that very question. What gives our actions purpose and direction?
Right, right.
What motivates us to move in the first place?
That's where Hull introduces this concept of drive.
Drive. Okay.
He defines this as an internal state of need that pushes us to act.
So things like hunger, thirst,
Yep.
the need for sleep, these are all drives that motivate us to behave in specific ways.
Exactly.
Okay,
Drives are the engine behind our actions.
got it.
They provide the energy and persistence that keep us moving towards a goal.
I can definitely relate to that.
Yeah.
When I'm really hungry,
Sure.
I'm way more likely to, go out of my way to find food.
Of course. Yeah.
But how exactly do drives work? Like, how do they influence our behavior?
Hull argues that drives influence both the intensity and the direction of our actions.
Okay.
So the stronger the drive, the more motivated we are to satisfy it,
Right.
and the more likely we are to choose actions that lead to that satisfaction.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If I'm only slightly thirsty,
Right.
I might just grab a glass of water from the tap.
Sure.
But if I'm parched after a long run, I might be willing to, go miles out of my way to find a cold drink.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Hull points to some fascinating research by a scientist named Kurt Richter
Okay.
to illustrate just how powerful drives can be.
Richter. Okay.
Richter observed that even seemingly random activity in rats is actually tied to their internal hunger cycles.
So even when those rats seem to just be, fidgeting,
Right.
their behavior is still influenced by their need for food.
Exactly.
That's wild.
It highlights how even simple actions can be driven by deeper motivational forces
Okay.
that we might not even be aware of.
That's incredible. It makes you wonder how many of our own, seemingly spontaneous behaviors are actually driven by underlying needs
Right.
that we're not fully conscious of.
Absolutely.
But up to this point, we've mostly been talking about inborn
Right.
instinctual behaviors, haven't we?
Sure.
What about learning?
Okay.
How do organisms go beyond those hardwired responses to acquire new adaptive behaviors?
That's a crucial question.
Yeah.
And it's where things start to get really, really interesting.
Okay.
Hull distinguishes between two main types of learning.
Two main types. Okay.
The first is what he calls selective learning,
Selective learning.
which involves strengthening a pre-existing response tendency.
So it's kind of like refining an existing skill or behavior.
Exactly.
Okay.
Imagine a rat that's learning to jump over a barrier to escape an electric shock.
Okay. Yeah.
It already has the capacity to jump.
Right.
But through selective learning, it becomes more likely to choose that specific action in that specific context.
That makes sense. So it's not that the rat is learning something entirely new,
Right.
but rather it's learning to apply an existing behavior more effectively
Right.
in a specific situation.
Exactly.
What about the other type of learning?
That's called conditioned reflex learning,
Conditioned reflex learning.
and it involves forming entirely new connections between stimuli and responses.
Okay.
You're probably familiar with Pavlov's famous dogs.
Oh, right. The ones that started drooling at the sound of a bell because they learned to associate it with food.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's a classic example of conditioned reflex learning.
Classic.
And what's fascinating is that Hull actually challenges Pavlov's explanation of this phenomenon.
He does. What does he propose instead?
Hull argues that learning isn't just about pairing stimuli.
Mhm.
It's about the consequences of our actions.
Okay.
He introduces the concept of reinforcement,
Reinforcement.
which is the idea that behaviors that lead to positive outcomes are more likely to be repeated in the future.
So it's not just about the bell and the food.
Right.
It's about the fact that the dog gets a tasty treat
Right.
as a result of salivating when the bell rings.
Precisely.
Got it.
And at the heart of this idea is a concept called habit strength.
Habit strength. What exactly does that mean?
Think of habit strength as a measure of how deeply ingrained a particular behavior becomes in our nervous system.
Okay.
The more times the behavior is reinforced, the greater its habit strength.
Right.
And the more likely we are to perform that behavior in the future.
So it's not just that we repeat rewarded actions.
Right.
but we actually develop stronger and stronger tendencies
Exactly.
to perform them over time.
That's the idea.
Interesting.
And Hull emphasizes that it's not just the number of reinforcements that matters,
Okay.
but also the amount and timing of those rewards.
So a bigger reward could lead to faster learning.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Hull highlights a fascinating experiment by W. Horsley Gant to illustrate this point.
Well,
Gant worked with dogs and carefully measured how the size of a food reward influenced the rate at which they learned a conditioned response.
interesting. And what did he find?
Gant discovered that the dogs who received larger food rewards learned much faster than those who received smaller rewards.
Okay.
Their learning curves were steeper,
Makes sense.
showing a clear link between reward size and the speed of habit formation.
That's fascinating. It's almost like our brains are wired to prioritize behaviors that lead to the biggest payoffs.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if we're constantly, even unconsciously, calculating the potential rewards of our actions.
That's a great insight.
Yeah.
And it highlights how even seemingly simple principles like reinforcement can have a profound impact on our behavior.
For sure.
But here's another question for you.
Okay.
We don't live in perfectly controlled experiments,
Right.
like Gaunt's dogs, do we? Life is messy, unpredictable.
Yeah, for sure.
How do we apply what we've learned in one situation
Right.
to new and different contexts?
That's a great question. It's like when you learn to ride a bike.
Okay, yeah.
You don't have to relearn the skill from scratch every time you get on a different bike,
Right.
even if it's a slightly different size or style.
And that's where the concept of stimulus generalization comes in.
Stimulus generalization.
It's the idea that organisms apply learned behaviors to similar situations,
Okay.
even if they're not exactly the same.
So we generalize what we've learned.
Exactly.
Okay.
Stimulus generalization is essential for adapting to a constantly changing environment.
Right.
It allows us to use our past experiences to guide our actions in new situations.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
If I learn to avoid a hot stove,
Right.
I don't want to have to relearn that lesson for every single stove I encounter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, as you might imagine, there are limits to generalization.
Right.
We can't just assume that every situation is the same.
Right. Right.
Hull introduces the idea of a generalization gradient to account for this.
A generalization gradient? What's that?
It's the idea that the further a stimulus is from the original one we learned from,
Okay.
the weaker our response will be.
So the more different a stove looks from the one that burned me,
Right.
the less afraid I might be of it.
Exactly.
Okay.
So it's not an all-or-nothing phenomenon.
Got it.
There's a gradual decline in our response as the situation becomes less and less familiar.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But how do we learn to make finer distinctions between similar situations?
Well, okay.
How do we learn to discriminate?
That's where discrimination comes in.
Discrimination.
Organisms can learn to distinguish between similar stimuli if only certain variations are consistently rewarded.
So if I burn myself on a gas stove,
Right.
but never on an electric one,
Right.
I'll eventually learn to fear only gas stoves.
Precisely.
Okay.
This process of discrimination is driven by what Hull calls differential reinforcement.
Differential reinforcement, okay?
We learn to fine-tune our responses based on which behaviors lead to positive outcomes in specific contexts.
This is starting to feel like a really powerful framework for understanding
It is.
how our behaviors are shaped. It's not just about instincts or reflexes.
Right.
It's about how our experiences, our interactions with the world,
Absolutely.
rolled our actions over time.
Yeah.
But it seems like we've mostly been talking about go, go, go.
Sure.
What about slowing down, hitting the brakes?
Okay.
Isn't there more to behavior than just acting all the time?
That's a great observation, and you're right. Sometimes it's just as important to know when to hold back
Right.
to inhibit a response.
Okay.
And that's exactly what we'll be diving into next.
Last time we were talking about how we learn to hit the brakes on certain behaviors.
Right.
You were about to tell us more about this idea of inhibition.
Yeah. Inhibition plays a crucial role in shaping our actions.
Okay.
It's that force that counteracts and sometimes even suppresses our behavior.
Right.
Keeps us from going full speed ahead all the time.
So it's kind of like the opposite of a drive. Instead of pushing us to act, it's holding us back.
You could think of it that way.
Okay.
Hull identifies two main types of inhibition that help explain how this works.
Two types.
The first is called reactive inhibition.
Reactive inhibition. Okay, what does that mean?
Think of it like a temporary state of fatigue
Okay.
that builds up when we repeatedly perform an action.
Okay.
It's that feeling you get when you've been working on a task for too long
Right.
and need to take a break.
Oh, I know that feeling all too well.
Yeah, we all do.
It's like my brain is saying, like, enough is enough, time for a change.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Your brain and body are telling you to stop and recharge.
Okay.
This reactive inhibition helps prevent us from getting stuck in a rut
Right.
and allows us to shift our focus to other activities.
Makes sense.
The second type of inhibition is called conditioned inhibition.
Conditioned inhibition. So this one is learned.
Precisely.
Okay.
It involves learning to not respond to a specific stimulus,
Right.
even if we might have previously been inclined to do so.
So it's like learning to ignore a distraction.
Exactly.
All right.
Hull uses a classic experiment by Pavlov to illustrate this.
Okay.
Remember Pavlov's dogs who learned to salivate at the sound of a metronome?
Yes, we were just talking about them earlier.
Right. Well, in this experiment, Pavlov started pairing the metronome with a whistle,
Okay.
but without giving the dog any food.
So the dog was getting the signal for food,
Right.
but then no food actually appeared.
Exactly.
Okay.
And over time, the dog learned to suppress its salivation response
Interesting.
when the whistle was present.
So the whistle meant, don't bother, it's not coming.
Exactly. Don't bother getting ready for food. It's not coming.
Wow. So even the absence of a reward can be a powerful teacher.
It can. It can.
It's like learning to recognize those signals that tell us when our efforts are likely to be futile.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Conditioned inhibition helps us avoid wasting time and energy
Right.
on actions that are unlikely to be successful.
Makes sense.
It allows us to be more selective in our responses and adapt to more complex environments.
This is all starting to paint a remarkably nuanced picture of how our behaviors arise.
It is. It is.
It's not just about drives pushing us forward or habits guiding our actions.
Right.
It's also about the ability to inhibit those impulses when it's appropriate.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And Hall's work is so fascinating
it is.
because he doesn't stop there.
Okay.
He recognizes that even with all these principles in place,
Right.
real organisms don't always behave in perfectly predictable ways.
Right. We're not robots after all.
Right.
There's an element of randomness.
Yeah.
Unpredictability in our actions.
Absolutely. And that's where the concept of behavioral oscillation comes in.
Behavioral oscillation.
A whole acknowledges that there's a certain amount of jitter or fluctuation in our responses,
Okay.
even under seemingly identical conditions.
So it's like our behavior has a built-in margin of error.
You could say that, but what's remarkable is that Hull doesn't see this variability as a problem or a flaw.
Interesting.
He actually incorporates this randomness into his system.
But how can you have a precise scientific system if you're factoring in randomness? It seems counterintuitive.
That's what makes Hull's approach so brilliant, you know? He doesn't shy away from the complexity of real-world behavior.
Okay.
He uses the concept of behavioral oscillation
Right.
to account for the fact that we're not perfectly predictable machines.
So instead of trying to eliminate variability,
Yeah.
he embraces it as a fundamental part of who we are.
Exactly.
Okay.
He recognized that living systems are dynamic
Right.
and constantly responding to a multitude of internal and external influences.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
It's like trying to predict the exact path of a leaf falling from a tree.
right.
There's so many factors at play.
Exactly.
The wind, the shape of the leaf, even tiny variations in air currents, that it's impossible to know exactly where it will land.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And just like that falling leaf, our behavior is influenced by a complex interplay of forces,
Right.
some of which are predictable and some of which are not.
Okay.
But even with this inherent variability, Hull believed we could still identify the underlying principles that shape our actions.
So how does he put all of these pieces together?
Okay?
We've covered drives, habits, inhibition, even randomness.
Yeah, it's a lot.
How does it all fit into this scientific system he was trying to build?
Hull's system is ultimately about explaining behavior in terms of clear, measurable concepts,
Okay.
moving away from subjective interpretations that rely on things like feelings or intentions.
So no more fuzzy notions of what's going on inside someone's head.
Precisely.
Okay.
Hull wanted to base his explanations on what we can actually observe,
Right.
the actions themselves and the factors that influence those actions.
Okay, that makes sense in principle.
Sure.
But behavior isn't always simple or straightforward.
Right.
How do we explain things like decision-making, where we have to choose between different courses of action?
That's where the concept of reaction potential comes in.
Reaction potential.
Think of it as a measure of the likelihood
Okay.
that a particular behavior will occur in a given situation.
So it's like trying to predict which action will win out
Right.
when different drives or habits are competing for our attention.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Reaction potential is influenced by a whole host of factors,
Right.
including the strength of the relevant habit,
Okay.
the intensity of the drive,
Right.
and even the presence of inhibition.
So if I'm really hungry,
Oh,
my habit of seeking food will have a high reaction potential. But
right.
if I'm also really tired,
Sure.
that fatigue might create enough inhibition to lower that reaction potential, even though I'm starving.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It's like a constant tug of war between these different forces,
Right.
with our final action being the result of this dynamic interplay. And the beauty of Hull's system is that he believed we could actually quantify these forces, express them mathematically,
Really?
use them to make predictions about behavior.
So it's like a formula for predicting what someone will do.
That was the idea.
That's wild.
He even developed equations to represent these relationships,
Oh.
allowing for precise calculations of how different factors would combine to influence action.
Okay.
It was a bold attempt to bring the rigor of mathematics to the study of behavior.
That's incredible.
It is.
But we're not just talking about simple reflexes here, right? Can this system really explain complex, learned behaviors as well?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Think about those classic experiments with rats learning to navigate mazes or press levers for food.
Right. Those experiments where the animals have to, like, figure out a sequence of actions
Yeah.
to achieve a goal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whole system can account for those scenarios too.
Okay.
He explained that as animals learn,
Right.
they're essentially building up habit strengths for specific action sequences that lead to the desired outcome.
So the more times a rat successfully runs the maze to get food,
Right.
the stronger the habit strength for that entire sequence of actions becomes.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that makes it more likely to repeat that sequence in the future.
And that's where reaction potential comes back into play.
Right, right.
A stronger habit strength translates into a higher reaction potential for
Yeah.
performing that sequence again in the future.
Precisely.
This is all starting to feel incredibly powerful.
It is. It is.
It seems like this system can explain not just simple actions, but entire chains of behavior that are learned over time.
That's the power of Hull's approach.
Yeah.
It provides a unified framework for understanding how relatively simple mechanisms,
Right.
like drives and habits,
Yeah.
can give rise to the remarkable complexity of behavior we see in both animals and humans.
It is mind-blowing.
It is.
But we're not just biological robots, right? We have thoughts, emotions, personalities, things that seem a lot harder to define and measure.
And Hull acknowledged that.
Okay.
While his system focused primarily on observable actions,
Right.
he didn't shy away from these more complex aspects of human experience.
Okay.
He believed that even seemingly subjective phenomena like personality
Yeah.
could ultimately be traced back to underlying biological mechanisms.
So you're saying our personalities are shaped by the same drives, habits, and inhibitions that influence our everyday actions.
That was his hypothesis.
That's fascinating.
He saw personality as arising from a complex interplay of these basic building blocks,
Right.
with individual differences emerging from variations in things like drive strength,
Okay.
the speed of habit formation,
Right.
and even susceptibility to inhibition.
So someone who's easily frustrated might have a lower threshold for reactive inhibition,
Could be.
and someone who's highly sociable might have a stronger drive for social interaction.
Exactly.
This is so interesting.
It's a fascinating idea, isn't
It
it?
is.
To think that these underlying behavioral mechanisms could contribute to the rich tapestry of personalities we see in the world.
And even though Hull's work has been refined and expanded upon over the years,
Oh, for sure.
it's amazing to see how his core principles continue to influence the field of psychology to this day.
Absolutely.
It really makes you appreciate the power of a clear,
Right.
systematic approach to understanding something as complex as human behavior.
It does.
Yeah.
And it reminds us that even though we might not always be aware of it,
Right.
there are underlying forces shaping our actions,
Right.
guiding our decisions,
Yeah.
and contributing to who we are.
So what does this all mean for us?
Yeah.
How can we use this knowledge to better understand ourselves and the world around us?
That's the beauty of it.
Yeah.
This isn't just about memorizing facts or theories.
Right.
It's about gaining a deeper appreciation for the
Yeah.
forces that drive our actions.
Yeah.
For the intricate interplay between our biology and our experiences.
Right. It's about seeing ourselves and others in a new light, understanding that our behaviors, even those that seem most spontaneous or unique,
Right.
are ultimately the products of these underlying principles.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And by understanding those principles,
right.
we can gain insights into our own habits and motivations.
Okay.
We can become more aware of the factors that influence our decisions.
Yeah,
And we could even start to see the world around us in a whole new way.
that's a powerful takeaway.
It is.
So as you go about your day, think
Yeah.
about the interplay of drives, habits, and inhibitions in your own life and in the actions of those around you.
Yeah, good idea.
You might be surprised by the insights you gain by viewing the world through the lens of Clark L. Hull's groundbreaking work.
You really might.
That's what these deep dives are all about.
That's right.
Exploring new ideas, expanding our understanding of the world,
Hmm.
and maybe even discovering a little bit more about ourselves along the way.
I think so.
Yeah,
So keep exploring, keep questioning,
right.
and keep that curiosity alive.
Until next time.
See ya.